So when I was in graduate school back in Maryland, I got called to jury service. And when you sit on a jury, the first thing you do is they bring you in and everyone stands in front of the judge, and the judge asks you lots of questions like, well, okay, do any of you know the defendant? Are any of you police officers, etc.? And then they let people go if they've got too close of a relationship to the case. And then they came up to this question, and the judge asked, okay, so is there anyone here who would be reluctant to vote guilty in a case if they knew that the defendant, or they're pretty darn sure the defendant did what they'd been accused of, but they still thought that that defendant shouldn't be punished for doing what they had been accused of? Well, I raise my hand, so I get called up to the judge's bench, and the judge says to me, well, look, what you've got to understand under Maryland law is the jury's job is not to decide on the sentence for someone. The jury's job is just to determine whether the person committed the crime they've been accused of or not. It's my responsibility as the judge then to give a sentence to this person. So you don't have to worry about finding them guilty because it's not up to you to give them the sentence. That's my job. So I said to the judge, yeah, but I'm also a person with, moral obligations, and if someone's done something that I don't think ought to be punished with, say, death, then I'm not going to find them guilty for something that I think is not wrong and that they shouldn't receive harsh punishment for. Well, needless to say, I got dismissed from the case. But what we can see going on in that story is that clearly the judge and I had very different ideas about what my moral obligations were in that situation. The judge seemed to take what Mark Wickler in his article about medical conscientious objection calls an internal morality. The judge seemed to think, look, there's this internal morality to being on a jury, that the job of the jurors is just to determine whether someone has committed a crime or not, and as long as you do that in the proper way, you don't let your own biases come into play, and you just, in good faith determine whether that person has committed the crime or not, then you've acted in a morally acceptable manner. Whereas I seem to think that there is some sort of external morality governing my behavior on that jury, where I would say, look, I get that in principle my duty as a juror is just to determine whether someone is guilty or innocent, but I think there's these principles that exist outside of my life just as a juror that say, hey, I should be paying attention to, for example, the consequences of my actions. If I judge that someone is guilty of something and that then causes them to be sentenced to death or to 20 years in prison because of something that really isn't of that great consequence, then I think I've done something morally wrong. Therefore, I have a duty to conscientiously object to just simply doing my job as a juror and figuring out whether the person did the crime or not. No, I have to take an action that's going to maybe maximize the good consequences, for example. And so Wickler makes this distinction between two different ways of thinking about professional obligations. One is in which you think there's a certain internal morality that governs the work that you do as a juror or as a physician or as a police officer, and that you have certain moral obligations that arise out of, say, what the purpose or the reason for your occupation is. So, for example, when it comes to medicine, some people say, look, the physician's job is to heal the patient, and so then your moral obligation is to do whatever is necessary to heal the patient, even if it means doing something that you otherwise, in, say, your personal life, wouldn't necessarily think is morally good to do. And so you might think, if there's this internal kind of morality that's operative, It's just morally wrong for you to conscientiously object to treating your patient in some way or another. Now, Wickler argues, look, even if there are these sort of internal moralities operating in jury service or in medicine, still, Wickler thinks, no, it's still morally okay in most circumstances for someone to conscientiously object to do the job that they are tasked with performing, whether it be being a doctor or being a member of a jury or being a police officer or what have you. Now, there's another way we could think about this. We could go and look at it in terms of this external morality. Wickler does that too. He says, okay, so let's put aside these concerns about internal moralities governing what a physician's duties are, and let's just think about society as a whole. Now, here you might think that a doctor is duty bound to perform certain procedures, not because of anything about the morality internal to medicine, but because they have a general agreement with the rest of the society. For example, by becoming a doctor, it's like you promise to do the sorts of things that doctors do. And then if you refuse to do some of those things, well, you've broken that promise. Or another way that he thinks about it is he says, look, by becoming a physician, you get certain privileges. You get a certain amount of pay and respect and protection under the law when you do certain procedures, and in return, you agree to perform the services of a physician. And so if you then object to performing some of those services, well, then you're breaking that agreement that you have with the rest of society. Now, Wickler here also argues that no, it's still permissible for you to object to do certain things, like to conduct, abortions or prescribe birth control or blood transfusions if you believe that that's morally wrong to do so. And you can still do that and not be violating any kind of agreement or promise that you have with society as a whole. Now, this judge could have objected in this respect to me as well. The judge could have said, look, you're a part of our larger society here. You live in Maryland now. You live there after you moved out here for grad school. And we provide you all kinds of services. And part of the agreement is that in exchange, you serve on juries. And that when you serve on a jury, you commit to just voting up or down whether someone is guilty or innocent, and you're not supposed to take into account how severe the punishment might be that they get if you find them guilty. So that's the kind of dynamic that's going on. What I want you to take away from this essay by Wickler and the other essay that I gave you this week about conscientious objection are these different ways of thinking about how people in lots of different professions need to weigh their professional obligations and their obligations to society in general. So even if you're not working on a research project having to do with medical ethics or police ethics, this pair of essays should help you think of some different perspectives on the profession that you're talking about and thinking about with your groups over the rest of the term.